The Hall of Ledgers had no windows, because the Concord of 900 did not believe that truth required a view. It was a long room, longer than any room on Earth, and it had been built 4,000 years before the first human learned to smelt iron. The walls were the color of old bone. The floor was a single slab of pressure-grown carbon, polished by the feet of delegations from every species the Concord had ever gathered, contacted, absorbed, or saved. There were grooves worn into that floor. 900 grooves, each one a path from a door to a desk, each one worn a few millimeters deep by the shuffling of feet across millennia. The newest groove was barely a scratch. It belonged to humanity. It was 14 years old. Wren Adeyemi-Sato stood at the head of it and tried to remember how to breathe like a person who was not afraid. She was 19 years old. Her badge said Registrar of Record, Terran Delegation, Provisional, and the word provisional had always struck her as the most honest word on it. She had gotten the post the way people got most posts in the human delegation. By being cheap, by being young, by having a memory that could hold the 11 grammatical moods of Concord formal without cracking, and by being willing to live on a station where the air smelled faintly of hot copper, and nobody had ever bothered to make a chair that fit a human spine. Her whole job, for 14 months, had been to write numbers into a book. It was a very old book. It sat now on the desk in front of her, open, its pages the pale gray of processed reef fiber, and it was the single most important object in the civilized galaxy. The Concord called it the Standing Ledger. Every species that had ever joined the Concord had a page in it. Every page bore, once per standard year, a single line of entry, written by that species' own registrar of record, in that species' own hand, in that species' own script. The line said what the species owed. Wren had written the human line 13 times. 12 of them had been trivial. Mineral tonnage from the series yards. Atmospheric processors returned for refit. A tally of Concord medical libraries accessed, which cost nothing but was recorded anyway, because the Concord recorded everything. Once, memorably, an apology for a human freighter captain who had gotten drunk and sung at a set funeral procession. The 13th line had been different. The 13th line had been the assessment. She could still see it, 4 pages back in her own careful hand. Classification affirmed. Class 4, dependent, NON sovereign, custodial. She had written it because she had been told it was a formality. She had written it because the ambassador had told her that everyone started at Class 4, and that in 100 years, maybe 200, humanity would be reassessed upward, and there was no sense making a fuss about a word. She had been 18. She had believed that a word was a word. Now she stood in front of the 14th line, and she understood, with a clarity that had arrived somewhere around the 3rd hour of last night and had not left her since, that a word was never just a word. A word was a door, and once you walked through it, the people on the other side got to tell you what room you were standing in. The chamber master's voice rolled down the hall. The Terran delegation stands at the ledger. Registrar, are you the appointed voice of your species? Wren looked up. The hall was full. It was always full on Ledger Day, but today it was fuller because the human entry was of interest, because humanity was new, and because the galaxy enjoyed watching the new ones learn how things were done. In the tiered galleries above her sat delegates from 400 worlds. She could pick out the Ovashka in their gray robes, the Set with their long pale hands folded, the Turanite hanging from their perches like sacks of patient stone, the Kel who never sat down and never spoke and had, according to legend, never once refused anything in 8,000 years. And on the high dais in the registrar-chancellor's seat sat von Eckert. He was set. He was 2.5 meters of narrow gray dignity, with a face like a carefully folded letter, and he had held his office for 640 years. He had watched 211 species make their first entry into the standing ledger. He had, by his own count, never seen one hesitate. He was watching her now, with the mild, patient, almost affectionate interest of a man watching a child pick up a spoon. "I am," Wren said. Her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "Wren Adeyemi-Sato, registrar of record for the species of Earth, appointed, sworn, and free." Appointed, sworn, and free. It was ritual language. Every registrar said it. She had said it 13 times without thinking about it once. "Then attend the assessment," said Ekit. A page of the ledger turned itself. The Concord did not need machinery for this. The book was old enough to be polite. The chambermaster read, "By the custodial covenant, ratified in the 412th session, and applied without exception to all species of Class 4, the Concord of 900 provides to the species of Earth the lane, the shield, the library, and the harvest guarantee. In consideration whereof, the species of Earth renders to the Concord the contribution of hands, at the rate assessed by the table of necessity, for the term of the covenant." He paused. The hall was very quiet. "The table of necessity, for the 15th cycle of the human page, assesses the contribution of hands at 41,600. There it was. 41,600 people every year. Young ones, healthy ones between the ages of 17 and 26, drawn by lottery from a planet of 9 billion, bonded for 12-year terms to the deep works, the lane-tending stations, the singularity foundries, the poison yards out past the cinder where the Concord built the engines that held the galaxy's roads open. 12 years. 60% came back. The Concord did not consider this cruel. The Concord considered it arithmetic. And it was legal. It was legal because Class 4 species were not sovereign. They were wards. And a ward could not sell itself, could not be enslaved, could not be taken. But a ward could be assessed, and a ward's guardian could render contribution on the ward's behalf, and the guardian of a Class 4 species was the Concord itself. The Concord had thought of everything. That was the horror of it. 4,000 years of thinking, and there was not one crack in the logic, not one loose brick, not one place where a decent person could put a crowbar and say, "Here, this is where you went wrong." The logic was perfect. It was only the conclusion that was monstrous. Wren's brother Kellen was 22. She had not thought about that in the hours she had spent last night with the covenant text spread across her bunk, and she thought about it now, and she found that her hands had gone very still. "Registrar," said Von Eckert kindly, "you may make the entry." The stylus lay across the open page. It was a simple thing, weighted, warm, older than her species' agriculture. Behind her, 3 meters back, Ambassador Ilse Kovac stood in the position of witness. She was 58, silver-haired, and the best diplomat Earth had ever produced, and she had told Wren 4 days ago, in a small room with the recorders off, the following thing: "They will not negotiate this. They have never negotiated this. 900 species have signed it, and 900 species are still here. Sign the line, and we spend the next 200 years working the classification upward, and in 200 years no more children go. That is the play. That is the only play. Do you understand me?" Wren had said yes. She had meant it at the time. She had meant it right up until she had gone back to her quarters and pulled the covenant text and read, in the 22nd annex, the clause about the entry itself. "The entry shall be made by the registrar of record in the hand of the species freely, without compulsion, coercion, inducement, or duress. And an entry made otherwise shall be void, and the covenant unformed and the species unbound." She had read it 11 times. The Concord had built consent into the ritual. Of course they had. They were not barbarians, they were bureaucrats, which was worse, and also, it turned out, better. They needed the line to be freely written, because an unfree line was not law, and the Concord's whole vast body, 900 species, 10,000 worlds, 4 millennia of unbroken peace, rested on the proposition that everything it did was law. They had made consent a requirement because they had never, not once, in 4,000 years, imagined it might be withheld. Wren looked at the stylus. She thought about the word provisional on her badge. She thought about her brother, who was a hydrologist, who was 22, who had a bad knee and a stupid laugh, and had cried at their mother's funeral so hard he had to sit down on the floor of the crematorium. She thought about the fact that if she wrote this line, the lottery would begin in 90 days, and it would take him or it would not, and either way the number would be 41,600, and either way she would have written it. And she thought about the word dependent. That was the part that had kept her awake, not the number, the word. Because the number was a robbery, and robbery you could survive, and robbery you could hate cleanly, and robbery did not require your participation. But the word was something else. The word was the Concord reaching into her species and telling it what it was: dependent, non-sovereign, custodial, ward. Not you have less power than us, that was true, that was simply true, but you are less. You are a thing that is looked after. You are a thing that is spent. And they wanted her to write it down, in her own hand, freely. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. Not just take what we want, but agree, in your own script, in your own words, that we were right about you. Wren Adeyemi-Sato picked up the stylus. She felt the hall settle, the small, satisfied exhalation of 400 delegations watching a young species learn its manners. She saw Kavach's shoulders drop a millimeter in relief. She saw Von Eckhitz's long hands unfold, ready to speak the closing formula. She set the stylus back down on the page, parallel to the line she had not written, and she stepped away from the desk. "No," she said. Nothing happened. It took her a moment to understand why nothing had happened, and then she understood. The translation matrices were confused. The Concord formal word she had used had 11 registers, and the machines were trying to determine which one a Class 4 registrar could possibly mean, and the answer they kept producing was none of them, because none of them applied, because in 4,000 years the word had never once been used in this room in this way. And so the matrices simply sat there, chewing, producing nothing. Wren said it again, in Concord formal, in the 9th register, the register used for refusing an offer of food. No, the Terran delegation does not make the entry. The Hall of Ledgers made a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a gasp. It was not an uproar. It was a sort of vast, dry, rustling confusion. 400 species all turning to their neighbors at once to ask whether they had understood correctly, and the sound of it was like wind moving through a library. Ambassador Kavach crossed the floor in 4 strides. She took Wren's arm above the elbow hard and put her mouth next to Wren's ear, and said in English very quietly, "You will pick up that stylus." "I can't," Wren said. "You will pick it up, and you will write the line, and then you and I will go back to the delegation, and I will personally ruin the rest of your life, but you will write the line." "Ambassador," Wren did not pull her arm away, she let it be held. She kept her eyes on the dais. "If you make me write it, it isn't free. And if it isn't free, it isn't law. Read the 22nd Annex." Kavach went absolutely still. "I read it 4 times, Wren said. "Then I read it 7 more. Ma'am, they need us to say yes. They built a door that only opens from our side. They've had it that way for 4,000 years and nobody ever noticed because nobody ever tried the handle." "Registrar." Von Eckhitz's voice came down from the dais, and it was not angry. That was the worst of it. It was gentle, and it was slightly amused, and it was the voice of a man explaining to a child that the ocean is not, in fact, negotiable. "I believe you have misunderstood the proceedings. Allow me to assist. The entry is not a request. The entry is a record. The contribution has been assessed. The covenant is in force. You are not being asked whether your species will render the contribution. You are being asked to write down that it has been assessed." "Then the Concord can write it," Wren said. "Silence." "It cannot," she went on, and her voice found something to stand on and steadied. "The Concord cannot write in the human hand. Annex 22. The entry must be made by the registrar of record freely without compulsion. The Concord's own law says so, not our law, yours, 4,000 years old. You wrote it yourselves. Ekhit's folded letter face did not change, but the delegates of the Ovashka, 3 tiers up in their gray robes, had gone very quiet and very forward in their seats. You are the registrar of record, Ekhit said. So make the entry. I decline. Then the Terran delegation will appoint another registrar, and that registrar will make the entry, and this. A small motion of one long hand, taking in Wren, the stylus, the whole absurd interruption will be a footnote. And there it was, the crack. Wren had spent all night looking for it, and she had found it in the driest, dullest, most bureaucratic sentence in the whole covenant, and she said it now, and she said it loudly enough that the galleries heard. A registrar appointed for the purpose of making an entry that the previous registrar refused on grounds of conscience is a registrar appointed under compulsion, and the entry made by such a registrar is an entry made under duress, and is void. She let out a breath. Annex 22, Subclause 4. Your own jurists wrote it after the Havrik tried to strong-arm the Ossuary Compact in the 1100s. You wrote it to stop the Concord's enemies from forcing signatures. Her jaw set. It works just as well against the Concord. The Hall of Ledgers erupted. Not into shouting, the Concord did not shout. It erupted into procedure. 40 delegations demanded points of order simultaneously. The chambermaster's staff struck the floor 11 times and had no effect whatsoever. The Kell, who had not spoken in 8,000 years, stood up, which was itself so unprecedented that a Turanite fell off its perch. And through all of it, von Ekhit sat perfectly still and looked at a 19-year-old human girl, and did something no one in the hall had ever seen him do. He leaned forward. "Child," he said, and the translation matrices rendered it with terrible precision, because the word he used was not an insult, and that made it worse. It was the set word for a thing that is small and new and not yet aware of the shape of the world. Do you understand what you have just done? I think so. You have not. He rose. He was very tall. Let me tell you then, and let it be recorded so that when your species asks why, it will have an honest answer and not a heroic one. He looked out over the hall. The lane is the Concord's road. It is held open by the deep works, and the deep works are held open by hands. Your species has 140 billion cubic meters of lane transit per cycle. Your grain worlds are seeded from the harvest guarantee. Your medicine is drawn from the library. Your sky is watched by the shield, and the reason no Havrik Reaver has come into your sky in 14 years is that the shield is there, and the reason the shield is there is the covenant. He came down one step of the dais. Refuse the contribution and you refuse the covenant. Refuse the covenant and you are not a ward of the Concord. You are outside it. Not our enemy, we do not make enemies of children, but outside. The lane will close to you. The library will close to you. The guarantee will lapse. The shield will lift. A pause. There are 11 million humans living and working on conquered worlds. Their residency flows from the covenant. Without it they are not residents. They are debris. Wren's hands were shaking now. She let them. And what will you have purchased, said von Ekhit, with all of that? A word. You will have purchased a word and your children will starve behind it. The hall waited. Wren Adeyemi-Sato looked up at him, 19, badly rested, wearing a uniform that did not fit, standing on the newest scratch in a 4,000-year-old floor, and gave the answer that would be carved, eventually, into stone on 300 worlds. You keep saying you're offering us protection, she said, but you're not. You're offering us a definition. And I can live without your lane, and I can live without your library, and I might not live without your shield. She swallowed. But I am not going to write down in my own hand that we are a thing that gets spent, because we're not. And no one gets to tell us what we are. Not you, not anybody, not ever. Then she turned, and she walked back up the human groove in the floor, 3 millimeters deep, 14 years old, the shallowest scratch in the Hall of Ledgers, and she left the line blank. They gave humanity 30 days. That was not mercy, that was procedure. The covenant provided for a period of reflection, during which a species that had failed to make its entry could reconsider, and during which the conquered could not act against it, and at the end of which the ledger would be brought forward and the page presented one final time. 30 standard days. It had been invoked 4 times in 4,000 years, always by species suffering some internal collapse, a plague, a civil war, a registrar who had died on the way to the hall. Every time, the entry had been made before the 30 days were out. The conquered expected the same now, not hoped, expected. Wren understood that expectation was the whole architecture of the thing. It was the load-bearing wall. The conquered did not rule the galaxy by force. It ruled by the perfectly reasonable assumption that everyone, in the end, would do the sensible thing. She spent the first 4 hours of the period of reflection in a locked room on the human station, being screamed at. You had no authority. Kavach was not screaming. Kavach never screamed. She was speaking in a low, flat voice that was worse. You had no mandate. You had no instruction. You are a 19-year-old clerk with a talent for grammar, and you have just unilaterally severed the human species from the largest political body in the history of life. I refused an entry. You made a policy, in front of 400 delegations, and now 9 billion people have to live inside it. They don't, Wren said. That's the point, they get to decide. Kavach stopped. They get to decide, Wren repeated. That's what I bought us. 30 days and a decision. Ma'am, before this morning there was no decision. There was a number and a lottery and a schedule, and everyone on Earth was going to wake up one day and find out that 41,000 of them had been chosen for something they never agreed to, and the only paperwork anyone could point to would have my name on it. She put her hands flat on the table because otherwise they would not stay still. I didn't decide anything. I just refused to decide it for them. The ambassador looked at her for a long, long moment. Then she sat down heavily in a chair built for a species with a longer spine, and put her face in her hands and said, God help us, that's actually a defensible position. The transmission reached Earth 11 hours later. The conquered did not censor it. That was, in retrospect, their first real mistake, and it was a mistake born of the same confidence that had built the annex in the first place. They broadcast the full proceedings of the Hall of Ledgers, as they always did, to every world in the conquered and to every candidate world beyond it, because transparency was one of the things the conquered was proud of. 900 species watched the human registrar set down the stylus. 900 species heard von Eckert explain, patiently, in his beautiful dry voice, exactly what humanity would lose. And 900 species, this was the part the conquered had not modeled, heard a 19-year-old say, no one gets to tell us what we are, in a room where a great many people had been told what they were for a very long time. On Earth, the transmission landed at 0440 Universal, in the middle of the night for most of the Western Hemisphere, and by dawn there was no city on the planet where it was not playing on every surface that could hold an image. The reaction was not what the conquered expected. It was also not what Wren expected, and she was human. Earth did not erupt in patriotic fury. Earth erupted in argument. It argued for 11 days. It argued in parliaments and in bars, in union halls and in orbit, in 20,000 town meetings and 400 million kitchens. It argued badly and loudly and often stupidly. Half the planet called Wren Adeyemi-Sato a hero. A larger half called her a lunatic, a child, a vandal, a girl who had set fire to the house because she did not like the wallpaper. 3 separate national governments demanded her immediate recall and prosecution. A former Secretary General went on air and said with real anguish that she had condemned people to death, and he was not wrong, and he knew he was not wrong, and he cried on camera. The arithmetic was public because the Concord published everything. Anyone could look it up. Without the harvest guarantee, the seed stock for the Sahel and the Deccan and the reclaimed Australian belt would revert to unmodified strains within 4 growing seasons. Call it a 19% drop in global caloric yield, which was not extinction but was famine, real famine, the kind with a body count. Without the library, 40% of Earth's clinical protocols would go dark, including the whole neurodegenerative suite. Without the lane, the colony's halcyon bright fork, the 8,000 people at Tesserin Reach were 9 years from home instead of 9 days. And without the shield. Nobody wanted to talk about the shield. Everybody talked about the shield. The Havrik were not a conquered species. They had been offered the covenant twice and had declined, and the conquered did not conquer, so the Havrik ran their long, ugly loops through the unbound systems, taking what they liked, and the reason they did not come to Earth was a conquered monitor station at the Sol boundary and a treaty line drawn on a chart. That was all. A station and a line. The line held because the Concord's law held. Wren watched it all from the delegation station, in a small room on a bad feed, and did not sleep. On the 6th day her brother called. Kellen was in Reykjavik in a hydrology lab, and he looked terrible, and the delay on the line was 4 seconds each way, which meant every silence was doubled. "They're saying your name on the street," he said. "Like a swear word and like a prayer, same street. Same hour." "I know. Rennie," he rubbed his face. "The lottery, if we sign, I'm 22, I'm in the band." Wren had known that. She had known it in the hall. She had known it with the stylus in her hand. Hearing him say it out loud was a different kind of knowing, and it went into her like a nail. "I know," she said. "So I want to say something, and I want you to actually hear it." 4 seconds. His jaw worked. "I've had 11 days to think about being one of 41,600, and what I keep coming back to isn't the 12 years. It isn't even the 40%. It's," he stopped, started again. "If we sign, then when they come for me legally, with paperwork, with my own species' signature on it. And I go and I work, and if I die out there, I die as a line item that we agreed to." His eyes were red. "I'd rather starve here than be spent there with our own name on the receipt. That's it. That's the whole thing I wanted to say." 4 seconds of silence doubled. "Don't you dare use that as a speech," he said. "It's just for you." She used it as a speech. He forgave her eventually. It took a while. The Concord did not sit still during the period of reflection. It did what it had always done, which was to be reasonable at scale, relentlessly. Delegations came to the human station. They came in the correct order of precedence, and they said, in essence, the same thing in 400 different grammars. The Turanite came and said, "We made the entry in the year your species was learning to bury its dead, and we are still here, and our children are numerous, and the deep works are hard, but the deep works are not forever, and you are being asked to be sensible." The Kell came and said nothing, which was their way, and left a stone on the threshold, which no human could interpret and which the xenologists argued about for a decade. And the Ovashka came. They came last, and they came without appointment, and there were only 2 of them, and the elder was named Aru, and she was very old. The Ovashka had been in the Concord for 2,300 years. They had rendered the contribution of hands every single year of it. They were a small, slow, gray-robed people with wet dark eyes, and their homeworld was beautiful, and there was not a family among them that had not sent someone out to the deep works and gotten back 60% of what they sent. Wren expected to be lectured. She was, in a way, not the way she expected. "You have made a mistake," Oru said, sitting on the floor of the room because human chairs were an insult to Ovashkan anatomy. "You believe you have found a flaw in the law. You have not. The law is perfect. That is what makes it terrible." Her hands moved, slow, folding. "I have read the 22nd Annex. I read it 400 years ago. Do you imagine you are the first ward to read it? Wren's stomach dropped. You knew. Every registrar knows. Oru's wet eyes did not blink. It is the first thing we learn and the last thing we say. There is a door and it opens from our side. Yes, of course. And every one of us in every generation has stood at that door and looked at what is on the other side of it and has picked up the stylus, because on the other side of that door is famine and darkness and the reavers in the sky. A long pause. We are not cowards, human. We are mothers. There is a difference, and the difference is that a coward saves herself. Wren could not speak. 2,300 years, Oru said. 41 million of my people have gone to the deep works. 24 million came back. I have signed the line myself 11 times, and I have been called wise for it, and I have wanted to eat my own hands. She rose with difficulty. So do not tell me you have discovered something. I am telling you that we all discovered it, and we all sat down again. She went to the door, stopped. But the word hung there. I did not come to persuade you. Then why did you come? Oru looked back over her shoulder, and her face did something that was probably not a smile, because Ovashka do not smile, but which lived in the same neighborhood. To see, she said, whether you would sit down. On the 19th day of the period of reflection, Earth held the vote. It was, procedurally, a catastrophe. There was no mechanism for it. There had never been a planetary referendum on anything. The human species had been in the Concord for 14 years and had never once been asked a question by it. So they improvised. 11 days of registration, 3 days of voting, a question drafted by a committee and rewritten 9 times, and finally reduced to 23 words that everyone hated and everyone understood. Shall the species of Earth make the entry required by the custodial covenant, rendering the contribution of hands, in exchange for the continuance of the covenant's protections? Yes, no. Turnout was 91%. It remains the highest in human history. Wren watched the count come in from a chair in the delegation's observation blister, with the whole cold rim of the galaxy hanging over her head, and she did not move for 6 hours. It was close, it was so close. The first returns were yes, heavily, the grain belts, the coastal megacities, the places where 19% meant a name and a face. Bangladesh voted yes. Egypt voted yes. The reclaimed Australian belt voted yes with a majority so large that the commentators said out loud that it was over. Then the Deccan came in and voted no by 4 points, and nobody could explain it, and a farmer in Nasik was interviewed and said, "They will take our children and give us seed. I would rather have my children and no seed. What do you not understand?" Then the tide turned and turned again, and by the 55th hour the whole planet was awake, and nobody was even pretending to work, and the totals were within 100,000 votes of each other with 200 million ballots left, and Wren Adeyemi-Sato, 600 light-years away, with her hands pressed flat against a viewport and her forehead against the glass, understood that she had done something that could not be undone, and that she was not, in fact, brave, she was only stubborn, and that the difference between those 2 words was going to be decided by people she would never meet. The final margin was 50.8%. No, 50.8% of the human species, in full knowledge of the price, having read the arithmetic, having seen the famine models and the medical models and the shape of a Havric reaver on a chart, chose to be told that they were on their own rather than be told what they were. It was not a landslide. It was not a great roaring unified human moment. Nearly half the planet had voted the other way, and they had voted the other way for reasons that were good and decent and loving, and they did not stop saying so, and they were not wrong to say so. But it was a majority. And the human species, which had been given 30 days to be sensible, sent a 19-year-old clerk back into the Hall of Ledgers on the 30th day with a single sentence to deliver. The hall was fuller than it had ever been. 900 delegations, every seat, The galleries had been extended into the vault. Von Eckert sat on the dais with the standing ledger open before him at the human page, and the 14th line was still blank, and the room was so quiet that Wren could hear the reef fiber breathing. "Registrar of Record," he said, "the period of reflection is ended. Your species has had 30 days to consider the arithmetic. Are you prepared to make the entry?" Wren stood at the head of the shallowest groove in the floor. She had rewritten the sentence 40 times on the flight in. She had cut it down and down and down until there was nothing left to cut, because she had learned something in 30 days about how the galaxy listened, and what it listened to was not eloquence. The Concord had 4,000 years of eloquence. It had libraries of it. Eloquence was cheap. What the galaxy had never heard was a small species saying a short thing and meaning it all the way down. "The species of Earth," Wren said, "has voted. 50.8% to 49.2. We decline the covenant. We decline the contribution. We decline the classification." She breathed. "We are not your ward. We were never your ward. We are a young, poor, badly organized people who are about to be very hungry, and we would rather be that than be a resource with a signature on it." Eckert's long hands lay still on the desk. "You understand," he said, "that I cannot save you from this. I know. You understand that I do not wish to harm you, that no one in this room wishes to harm you, that the severance is not a punishment but a consequence, that we will simply stop, and that stopping is enough." "I know that too." Wren's voice cracked and she let it and did not apologize for it. "That's what makes it evil, sir. You've built a thing where you never have to lift a hand. You just take yours away." For the first time in 640 years, the Registrar-Chancellor of the Concord of 900 did not have an answer ready. He closed the standing ledger. The sound it made was very soft, and it went all the way to the back of the hall. "Then it is done," said Von Eckert. "Let the record show that on this day the species of Earth declined the custodial covenant, and that the Concord, in accordance with its law, withdraws from the species of Earth the lane, the shield, the library, and the harvest guarantee, effective at the close of this session." A pause, and then, quietly, in a register the translators struggled with, a register that was not formal at all, "and let the record show that they were told." The severance began 4 minutes later. The severance was not dramatic, it was administrative. That was the whole design. At 19:04 Concord Standard, the lane beacons at the Sol boundary went from green to gray. They did not shut down. They simply stopped acknowledging human transponders. A grain freighter 3 hours out of the Halcyon run found itself on the wrong side of a door that was not locked, merely closed, and had to burn 11 days of reserve fuel to come home the slow way, and made it, and its captain wept on the dock. At 19:06, the library revoked its keys. 900,000 medical terminals on Earth flashed a courteous message, in 11 languages, thanking the user for their access and wishing them well. At 19:11 the harvest guarantee lapsed. Nothing happened. That was the cruelty of it. Nothing happened, and would keep happening nothing, for 4 growing seasons, until the modified seed stock reverted and the yields fell, and the number 19% stopped being a number. And at 19:40, the Concord monitor station at the Sol boundary lit its engines and left. It did not fire on anything. It did not threaten. It simply went on a lazy, elegant curve, and its departure was broadcast live, and 800 million humans watched a small silver shape shrink into nothing, and understood that the sky above their planet had just become an ordinary sky, an unwatched sky, the kind of sky their ancestors had lived under. The Haverick took 19 days to come. They came to Tesserin Reach first, because Tesserin Reach was the smallest and the furthest and the softest. 8,000 people, mostly hydroagronomists and their families, on a cold blue world with 3 moons. There is no gentle way to describe what a Haverick Reaver does to an undefended colony, and this account will not attempt one. It is enough to say that the Concord's own after-action file, published in full because the Concord published everything, records that the colony's defense consisted of 2 orbital survey drones and a mining charge, and that the last transmission out of Tesserin Reach was not a distress call. It was a census. The colony administrator, a 51-year-old woman named Adeyemi Nwasu, spent the final 40 minutes of her life reading names into a recorder. 8,106 of them. First name, family name, age, birthplace. She got through 6,200 before the signal ended. The Concord received the transmission as it received everything, and filed it as it filed everything. And because the standing ledger's rules required that all communications from a severed species be entered into the public record, broadcast it, in full, unedited, to 900 worlds. 6,200 names. 11 hours of a human woman's steady voice, saying names, in a room that was getting louder. The Concord had, in 4,000 years, never made a mistake of this magnitude, and it never understood that it had made one, because from the inside it was not a mistake. It was procedure. Wren heard it in the delegation station's mess hall, at 0300, alone, with a cup of cold tea in front of her. She listened to the entire 11 hours. She did not eat. When it finished mid-name, mid-syllable, a woman saying Obi Chinlo, age 6, born at Tesserin Ray, and then nothing, she sat for another 40 minutes without moving. Then she went and was sick, thoroughly, in the corridor, and then she washed her face, and then she went to find Ambassador Kovach. Kovach was awake. Kovach had been awake for 2 days. She was sitting at her desk with a bottle of something amber and untouched in front of her, and when Wren came in, she did not look up. 8,106, Kovach said. I know. You did this. I know. The ambassador finally raised her head, and Wren was ready for hatred and did not find it, and what she found instead was worse. A woman looking at her with enormous, exhausted, unbearable tenderness. Sit down, Kovach said. You are 19 years old and you are carrying 8,000 people and you are going to carry more before this is finished, and if you carry them standing up you will break your spine. Sit down. Wren sat down. Now listen to me, because I am going to say this once and then we are going to work. Kovach leaned forward. You did not kill them, the Havrik killed them, and the Concord let the Havrik in, and the Concord will tell you correctly that they did not let them in, they merely stopped keeping them out, and that this is a different thing. And when they say that, you are going to say, no, it isn't. She poured 2 fingers of the amber into a glass and pushed it across. That is the entire war, Wren, not ships, that sentence. No, it isn't. Wren looked at the glass. They're going to send an offer tomorrow, she said. Of course they are. Reinstatement, full covenant, shield backup within 90 hours, retroactive residency for the 11 million, and her mouth twisted, a compassionate adjustment. Contribution reduced to 38,000 for the first cycle. In light of the tragedy. Kovach closed her eyes. In light of the tragedy, she repeated, they will genuinely believe they are being kind. They are being kind. Wren's voice was flat. That's the thing nobody on Earth understands. They aren't monsters. Ekhit isn't a monster. He's a good administrator of an evil arrangement, and he can't see the difference, because nobody in 4,000 years has stood in front of him and made him look at it. She picked up the glass. She did not drink it. She set it down. So I'm going to make him look at it. The Concord's offer arrived at 11:00. It was gracious, it was generous, it was formally faultless, and it contained in its 9th paragraph the sentence that decided everything that followed. The Concord notes with sorrow the events at Tesserin Reach, and observes that such events are the predictable outcome of the human species' decision, and trusts that the human species will now, having been instructed by experience, resume its proper place. Kovach read it aloud twice. Instructed by experience, she said. Yeah. They put it in writing. They put everything in writing. Wren was already pulling the ledger archives, her hands moving fast across the interface, faster than she had moved in days, because something had come loose in her chest and turned into fuel. That's what I need you to understand, ma'am. They have 4,000 years of public records, and they have never once had to be ashamed of any of it, because nobody who read them was allowed to say anything back. Kavech came and stood behind her chair. What are you doing? Arithmetic, said Wren. It took her and 11 volunteers 8 days. The standing ledger was public. Every entry, every species, every cycle, 4,000 years deep, freely searchable, because the Concord was proud of its transparency and had never imagined that transparency could be a weapon. The human delegation had the access rights of a severed species, which was to say, read-only, permanent, and unrestricted, because the law said a severed species retained its right to inspect the record of what had been done to it. They pulled every contribution of hands ever assessed, 900 species, 4,112 years. They pulled every return rate report from the deep works, which the Concord also published, because the Concord published everything. Then they did what no one in the Concord had ever done, because it had never occurred to anyone that it was a question worth asking. They added it up. 209 billion. That was how many sentient beings had been rendered as contribution of hands since the custodial covenant was ratified. 209 billion. Of those, 61 billion had not come home. And then Wren went looking for the other number, the one that made her hands go cold, the necessity. The table of necessity assessed the contribution based on the Concord's requirement, how many hands the deep works needed to hold the lanes open. She pulled 4,000 years of deep works engineering reports and fed them to every human engineer she could find, and they came back to her, 40 of them from 6 different worlds, all with the same white-faced answer. The deep works had not needed that many hands for 2,600 years. Automation had solved it. Slowly, incrementally, cycle by cycle, the Concord's own engineers had built lane tenders and foundry drones and self-repairing singularity scaffolds, and the actual labor requirement of the deep works had fallen by 94% over 26 centuries. The contribution had not fallen. It had risen. Because the table of necessity had never been recalculated. Because recalculating it had never been anyone's job. Because the contribution was not and had not been for 2.5 millennia about labor at all. It was about the covenant. The contribution was the thing that made the ward a ward. It was the annual proof, rendered in flesh, that the species accepted the arrangement. It had stopped being a tax and become a ritual, and nobody had noticed, because in a bureaucracy old enough, nobody is required to notice anything. Wren Adeyemi-Sato sat in a small room 600 light-years from her planet, at 4 in the morning, looking at a number 61 billion dead, 94% unnecessary, and did not feel triumph. She felt sick. And then she felt something colder and steadier than triumph, and she pulled her terminal toward her, and she began to write. She did not write to the Concord. That was the second thing the Concord failed to model, and it was fatal. She wrote to the wards. 900 species had a page in the standing ledger. 900 species had a registrar of record, some ancient, some young, some hereditary, some drawn by lot, and every single one of them had, at some point, learned the 22nd annex and stood at the door and sat back down. The human delegation had the address of every one of them, because the Concord published everything. The document was 14 pages. It was not a manifesto. Wren had learned by then that manifestos were for people who wanted to be admired. It was a ledger. It listed for each species, in that species' own script, drawn from the Concord's own public archive. the number of hands that species had rendered, the number that had not returned, the number the deep works had actually required in each cycle, calculated from the Concord's own engineering reports. And the difference. At the bottom of each page, one line, the same line, translated into 900 languages. This is what was taken from you. The Concord did not lie to you. It simply never added it up, and neither did you, and neither did we until now. We are not asking you to fight. We are not asking you to refuse. We are only asking you to look, because we think you have the right to know what you have paid, and we think the arrangement has survived this long precisely because nobody was ever handed the total. And underneath that, the last paragraph, the one that was quoted on 900 worlds within a month. They are not lying to you when they say the arrangement keeps the peace. It does. It has kept the peace for 4,000 years, and it is the most successful political structure in the history of this galaxy, and we are not pretending otherwise. But peace is not the same as justice, and safety is not the same as dignity, and a thing can be orderly and lawful and stable and still be wrong. They will tell you that refusing costs too much. They are right. It costs everything. We have already begun to pay it. 8,106 of us are dead at Tesserin Reach, and there will be more. And we are not brave, and we are frightened, and we are doing it anyway, not because we think we will win, but because there is a difference between a people who are poor and a people who are owned, and we would like our children to be the first one. She signed it, and then she looked at the signature line for a long time, and then she deleted her name and wrote instead, Wren Adeyemi-Sato, Registrar of Record Terran Delegation, 19 years old, nobody important. Kavech read it over her shoulder and said, "Take out nobody important. It's false modesty and it's a lie." "It's not modesty," Wren rubbed her eyes, "it's the argument. If a nobody can refuse, then everybody can." Kavech was quiet. "Send it," she said. The Concord's response was swift, correct, and catastrophic. They classified the document as seditious correspondence between wards, invoked a statute that had not been used since the ossuary crisis, and ordered it removed from all Concord relays. Which meant that every species in the Concord learned on the same day two things: that a document existed and that the Concord did not want them to read it. 4,000 years of perfect transparency, and the first thing they had ever suppressed was a page of their own arithmetic. The Ovashka published it on their own relay within 9 hours. They did it without comment. They simply put it up in Ovashkan script on the public feed of their homeworld and let it sit there. And when the Concord's inspectors demanded it be taken down, the Ovashkan speaker, an old woman named Oru, who had signed the line 11 times, came to the relay station in her gray robes and stood in front of the transmitter and said one sentence, which was recorded and which traveled. "We would like to see the total." Within 30 days it was on 400 worlds, within 90 on all 900. It could not be stopped, because the Concord's own network had been built on the assumption that nothing in it would ever need to be stopped, and because, as one set jurist noted bitterly, in a memorandum that later became famous, you cannot suppress a document that consists entirely of your own public records, added up. The wards read it. And the wards, being sensible people who had families, who had lived their whole lives inside an arrangement that worked, who were not fools and were not heroes and had a great deal to lose, the wards did nothing. For 11 months, they did nothing at all. That was the part nobody remembered afterward, and it was the part Wren remembered most. 11 months of nothing. 11 months of Earth going hungry, of the Haverick Loop tightening, of 2 more colonies lost, of the 11 million stateless humans on conquered worlds being processed out of residency in the correct legal order, politely, with adequate notice. 11 months of the galaxy reading a page of arithmetic and looking away from it. She was 20 by then. She had stopped sleeping properly. She had a scar on her hand from a bulkhead she had punched exactly once in a bad hour and had never told anyone about. And on the last day of the 11th month, the Ovashkin homeworld's lane collapsed. It was not sabotage, it was age. The Ovashkin lane node had been running for 2,200 years, and the Concord's maintenance schedule was, like everything the Concord did, correct. And the schedule said the node was due for its deep refit in 11 years, and the schedule had been right for 2,200 years, and then it was wrong. The node's containment lattice went out of phase at 0614 local. The lane did not explode. Lanes do not explode. The lane simply folded, the way a road folds when the ground under it dissolves, and it took with it 400 kilometers of transit shell, 2 Concord tenders, and this was the part that mattered, the entire inbound supply corridor to the Ovashkin homeworld. Ovashka was a beautiful world and a poor one. It grew almost nothing. It had traded its agriculture away 800 years ago for a place in the Concord's manufacturing web, which was efficient, which was rational, which meant that 91% of its food arrived through the lane. The Concord moved immediately. The Concord was, whatever else it was, extremely good at logistics. Emergency assessment, node repair in 140 days minimum, alternate corridor via the Kell Reach, possible at 40% throughput in 60 days. Caloric shortfall for the interim, catastrophic. Estimated Ovashkin deaths, at best case, with the full and immediate mobilization of the Concord's emergency reserves, 900,000. The Concord published this, of course it did. Wren read the estimate at 0200 in the same small room with the same cold tea. Then she pulled the star charts. Then she sat very still for 4 minutes. Then she woke up Ambassador Kovach by kicking her door until it opened. 16 days, Wren said. What? Ovashka, from Earth. Not through the lane's gone for everybody, they're all going the slow way now. She had the chart on her tablet and she shoved it into Kovach's hands. The Concord's reserve depots are all lane side. Their fast ships are lane ships. Everything they've built for 4,000 years assumes the road is there. When the road folds, they're the slowest people in the galaxy. Kovach, who had been asleep for 90 minutes in 3 days, stared at the chart. And we, Wren said, have been outside the lane for 11 months. The ambassador's eyes came up. We've been running sublight convoys since the severance because we had no choice, Wren said, and her voice was shaking, and it was not fear. Halcyon runs. Bright Fork runs. We've been building torch freighters for 11 months because we couldn't use their road. Ma'am, we are the only species in this galaxy with a working sublight logistics fleet, because we're the only species they threw out. Kovach did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, how many ships? 14 that can make 16 days, 22 more at 23 days. Wren swallowed. It's our reserve. It's the series grain and the Bakel stock and the seed banks. It's 14% of our margin. We are already in famine. The models say if we send it, we lose somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people over the next 3 years. Our people. Old people mostly. Children in the deficit belts. And if we don't send it, 900,000 Ovashka die. Kovach sat down on the edge of her bunk. They signed, she said quietly. Every year for 2,300 years they signed, and part of what they were buying with those signatures was that we would starve alone. Yes. And if we send it, Kovach's voice was very steady and very tired, the Concord will say we did it to be admired, to win, to make a point. Yes. And they will half be right. Wren stood in the doorway, 20 years old, with a scar on her hand nobody knew about. No, ma'am, she said, they won't. It went to Earth. Of course it went to Earth. Wren had learned that lesson in a locked room a year ago, and she never unlearned it. She did not decide things for 9 billion people. The debate lasted 40 hours. It was, if anything, uglier than the first one, because the first one had been about principle and this one was about grain, and because the people who had voted yes a year ago, half the planet half, who had never stopped being right about the price, now had to be asked to give away the food they had been left with. Wren watched a woman from the Deccan speak in the assembly. She was a farmer. She had voted no a year ago, and she had lost a daughter in the first bad winter after the guarantee lapsed, and she stood up and said, "They will say we did it for glory. Let them. We did not do the first thing for glory, and we were still called proud. We will not do this thing for glory either, and we will still be called proud." She looked at the camera, and she was not eloquent. She was just old and tired and unbudgeable. "I have nothing. I am giving some of my nothing to people who have less. If the galaxy needs a reason, it can find one. I am not in the business of explaining myself to people who eat every day." The vote was 71%. The margin this time was not close at all. 14 ships left Earth on the 9th day of the Ovashkin crisis. 22 more followed in the second wave. They were ugly. They were converted ore haulers and old colony transports, and one repurposed cruise liner that still had a swimming pool in it. And they were crewed by volunteers, and every one of them was making a run that no sane logistics officer would have approved, because they were burning fuel margins that assumed nothing would go wrong for 16 consecutive days. Something went wrong. On day 11, the freighter Ansukaba lost primary containment on its number 2 torch. It could not stop. Stopping meant arriving late, and arriving late meant arriving after. Its crew of 9 ran the remaining 4 torches at 111% for 140 hours, and they got the grain there, and 6 of the 9 died of exposure over the following 2 years. They knew when they made the decision roughly what it would cost them. It is recorded on the ship's log, which the Concord, because the Concord published everything, later entered into the standing ledger in full. The log says, in the flight engineer's handwriting, "Ran the numbers, it's us or them. Voted, it's us. Nobody argued. Somebody tell Wren we weren't being noble, we were being stubborn, and she'd know the difference." The human convoy arrived at Ovashka on the 16th day. The Concord's first relief ships arrived on the 58th. There is a recording. There are 10,000 recordings, but there is one taken from the surface of Ovashka at the Selet landing field on the 16th day. It shows a gray sky and a long muddy plain and a crowd of Ovashka standing in the rain, silent, in the way that species is silent, and then it shows 14 ugly ships coming down through the cloud on their tails of hard white fire, and the sound is terrible, and the crowd does not move. The ramps come down, and the humans who come down the ramps are thin. That is the thing everyone noticed. That is the thing that was pointed at on 900 worlds for the next 400 years. The humans who came off those ships were visibly, obviously, clinically hungry. They had been on ration for 11 months. They had brought food to a starving world across 16 days of hard burn, from a planet that was itself in famine, and they came down the ramps with their belts pulled in. And the first thing the convoy master did, a Sri Lankan woman named Parara, 44, who had lost a nephew at Tesserin Reach, was walk to the Ovashkan speaker in the rain and say, "We brought what we had, it's not enough, we're sorry." And old Oru, in her gray robes, standing in the mud on the world she had bought with 11 signatures and 41 million hands, looked at a starving woman apologizing for the size of a gift she should never have given at all. And the Ovashka, who do not smile and who do not kneel, and who had knelt to nothing but the Concord in 2,300 years. The Ovashka did not kneel. They stood. The whole plain, 200,000 of them in the rain, standing up straighter, all at once, which in Ovashkan means precisely one thing and has meant it since before the Concord existed, and which their language renders with a word that the human translation matrices, after some argument, settled on as witnessed. The Concord's public statement on the human relief action was released 4 days later. It was 11 paragraphs long. It thanked the human species for its assistance. It noted that the assistance had been unauthorized, unregulated, and conducted outside the Concord's logistics protocols, and that this had introduced risk. It observed that the human species remained severed, and that its action did not alter its status. It expressed the hope that the human species would recognize, in the events of the past year, the value of the arrangement it had rejected. And in the ninth paragraph again, and Wren was never sure whether that was coincidence or whether some junior set clerk in the drafting office had done it on purpose and had a private, terrified, joyful little moment at their desk. It said, "The Concord notes that the human species, being severed, was under no obligation to render aid, and that it derived no benefit from doing so." 900 Worlds read that sentence. 900 Worlds had spent 11 months looking away from a page of arithmetic that said 61 billion. And 900 Worlds now had, sitting next to that page, an image of thin humans coming down a ramp in the rain, and an official statement from their own government confirming that the humans had gotten nothing out of it. The Concord had, without ever intending to, and entirely by following its own rules, done the one thing a 4,000-year-old bureaucracy must never do. It had shown its wards the difference between a gift and a payment. Kell is a hard species to describe and a harder one to understand, and 8,000 years of Concord xenology had produced exactly one solid conclusion about them, which was that they did not refuse. They did not refuse invitations. They did not refuse assessments. They did not refuse the contribution. They had rendered hands every cycle since the Covenant's 2nd century, without complaint, without negotiation, without a single recorded instance of dissent, and the Concord regarded them as the model ward, and cited them constantly, and put them at the front of every procession. The Kell Registrar of Record came to the Hall of Ledgers on the first day of the 4,114th session. She walked the Kell groove, which was 9 centimeters deep. She stood at the desk. The chambermaster read the assessment. The table of necessity assessed the Kell contribution at 206,000 hands. And the Kell Registrar of Record picked up the stylus and held it and looked at it and set it down across the page. And said nothing. The Kell do not speak. They had not spoken in 8,000 years. She said nothing at all, and she stepped back from the desk, and she left the line blank, and she walked back up the groove, and the Hall of Ledgers watched her go in a silence that had a texture to it, a weight, a thing pressing down. Von Eckert sat on the dais and did not move. The Turanite were next in precedence. The Turanite registrar came down from the galleries. He was old and heavy, and he took a long time to descend, and the whole hall watched him do it, and every being in the room understood that a hinge was swinging. He reached the desk. The chambermaster read the assessment. And the Turanite registrar of record, whose species had made the entry in the year humanity was learning to bury its dead, whose delegation had come to the human station 11 months ago and counseled since, said, in a voice like gravel in a barrel, "We would like to see the total." He left the line blank. The Ovashka were next. Oru had not come. Oru was very old, and Oru was on her homeworld, standing in a muddy field, and she had sent instead her granddaughter, who was young, and who walked the 2,300-year groove with her hands folded and her wet dark eyes fixed on the dais, and who did not touch the stylus at all. By the end of the session, 41 species had left the line blank. By the end of the month, 311. By the end of the cycle, the standing ledger of the Concord of 900 contained 849 consecutive blank lines, and the arrangement that had governed 10,000 worlds for 4,114 years had ended, without a shot fired, without a fleet moving, without a single act of violence anywhere in the civilized galaxy, because a great many people had picked up a stylus and looked at it, and put it down again. They summoned Wren Adeyemi-Sato to the hall on the last day of the cycle. She was 20 years old. She had not been home in 2 years. Her species was still severed, still hungry, still unshielded. The Havok were still running their loops. Tesserin Reach was still a name that made her stop mid-sentence. Nothing the galaxy had done in the last 100 days had put a single kilogram of grain on Earth, or a single ship in Earth's sky. She walked into a room containing 900 delegations, and every one of them stood up. She did not know what to do about that. She stood in the doorway with her badly fitting uniform and her cheap boots, and she had prepared a speech, and she looked at 849 species on their feet and understood that the speech was worthless, and she left it in her pocket. Von Eckert was waiting at the ledger. He looked older. 640 years had not aged him, and 11 months had. His long, pale hands were resting on the closed book, and when he spoke, the hall went so quiet that the reef fiber pages were audible again. "Registrar of Record," he said, "the Concord has convened to address the state of the standing ledger." "I know why I'm here," Wren said. "Do you?" It was not a question. He turned the book toward her and opened it, not to the human page, but to the beginning, to the first page, to a line written in a script so old the translators had to be told what it was. "This is the first entry. It was made by a species called the Semet, 4,114 years ago. They rendered 900 hands. There are no Semet now. They died of a thing we could not cure, and their world is a monument, and their page is the first page of this book." He turned pages, slowly, hundreds of them. "I have spent my life keeping this," he said. I do believe, that this book has done more good than any object in the history of thought. Before the Covenant there were 40,000 years of war. After it there were 4,000 years of peace. That is not propaganda, Registrar. That is the record. I have read the record." "I know," said Wren. "I read it too." "Then tell me." Eckert's voice did not rise. It cracked very slightly in the middle, and that was worse than rising. "Tell me what I am supposed to do with 61 billion. The hall held its breath. And Wren Adeyemi-Sato, who had not slept properly in 2 years, who had a scar on her hand, who was 19 when she started and 20 now, and who had never in her life wanted to be anybody's symbol, said the thing she had been trying to find words for since the night she first read the 22nd Annex. "Sir," she said, "you're asking the wrong question, and you've been asking it for 4,000 years, and everybody's been answering it, and that's how we got here." "Then what," said von Eckert, "is the right one?" "The question you keep asking," Wren said, "is what do we owe you, and it's a real question. I'm not going to stand here and pretend it isn't. You built the roads, you hold them open, you cured things. You stopped 40,000 years of war, and I am not too proud to say thank you for that. And neither is my species, and any human who tells you otherwise is a fool." She put her hands on the desk. She was not tall enough for it. She had never been tall enough for it. "But every year in this room you asked 900 species what they owed you, and you never once asked them what they were." Her voice was steady. "You decided that yourselves, Class 4, dependent, non-sovereign, custodial. And then you asked us to write it down in our own hands so it would be legal. And everyone did, because the alternative was starving, and because they were tired, and because they had children, and because you were right that it was the sensible thing to do. It was the sensible thing to do." "It was." Wren's hands came off the desk. "That's what I've been trying to make you understand for 2 years. It was sensible. It is sensible. It would be sensible for us to sign right now. We're starving, Chancellor. We are actually starving. 400,000 of my people are going to die in the next 3 years because of what I did, and I could stop it in 10 seconds with a stylus." She was breathing hard. "And I won't. And that isn't because I'm brave, and it isn't because I'm clever, and it isn't because I found a hole in your law. It's because there is one thing a person can refuse to give you even when you have taken everything else, and it's the right to say what they are. She looked up at him. You wanted us to agree that we were a resource, not to be one. Anyone can be made into one. You're stronger than us. You could have just taken the hands and we couldn't have stopped you. You wanted us to agree, in writing, freely, because a resource that agrees stays a resource forever, and a resource that refuses is just a person you're robbing, and you didn't want to be robbers. You wanted to be right. Von Eckert stood very still. And that, Wren said more quietly, is the whole flaw. That's the crack that was in this book from the first page. You needed our consent, and you never noticed that needing it meant we had it. 4,000 years, sir. 4,000 years you were holding the door open and telling everyone it was locked, and the reason nobody tried the handle is that everybody was being sensible. The Hall of Ledgers did not move. So here's the right question, said Wren Adeyemi-Sato. It's not what do we owe you, it's what are we to each other. She shrugged, and the shrug was pure, exhausted, 19-year-old clerk who never asked for this. And you don't get to answer that one alone. Nobody does. That's the only rule there is. The Concord did not fall. That is the part of the story that people get wrong, and Wren spent the rest of her life correcting them, usually in a tone of considerable irritation. The Concord did not fall, and the covenant was not torn up, and there was no reckoning, no tribunal, no fleet of righteous ships. 900 species had, quite suddenly, no legal instrument governing their relations, and a folded lane at Ovashka, and a deep works that needed 140,000 hands a year and had been taking 2 million, and a bureaucracy that had never once had to invent anything. It was a mess. It was a mess for 19 years. The standing ledger closed. Von Eckert closed it himself, in front of 900 delegations, and did not make a speech, and carried it out of the hall in his own arms, and the historians would argue for centuries about the expression on his face and would never settle it. What replaced it took 4 years to draft and was called, in the end, the Free Register, and it was a worse instrument than the Covenant in almost every measurable way. It was slower. It was messier. It required unanimity where the Covenant had required only compliance, and the negotiations were interminable, and 3 species walked out and stayed out for a generation, and the lanes ran at 60% for a decade because nobody could agree on how to crew them. The deep works were staffed in the end by volunteers, paid ones, insured ones who could quit. The recruitment problem was severe and the wage bill was ruinous, and the Concord's economists said, correctly, that it was catastrophically inefficient compared to the contribution of hands. And every one of them went home. That was the number Wren kept in her head for the rest of her life. Not 61 billion. That one she carried, but she did not keep it. She set it down eventually, the way you have to. The one she kept was the return rate. 100%. Humanity paid. It is important that this be said plainly, because the story is often told as though the Defiance was free once the galaxy turned, and it was not. The galaxy turned in the 14th month. The lanes did not reopen to Earth for 6 years. 6 years, 2 more colonies gone. 411,000 dead in the famine belts. The number came in higher than the models, because the models had not accounted for the second bad winter. 11 million stateless humans scattered across 100 worlds, most of whom found somewhere to stand, many of whom did not, some of whom never came home. The Havrik were pushed out of human space in year 3, and they were pushed out by a coalition of warred species who had no legal authority to do it, no mandate, and no agreement among themselves. Ovashka and Turanite and 11 others, who simply showed up in Sol with everything they had and sat there in orbit for 19 months, until the Havrik stopped coming. They were not paid for it, they were not asked. When Earth's government sent a formal request for terms, the Ovashkin reply consisted of 4 words, and it is engraved now on a wall in Lagos. We brought what we had. Wren Adeyemi-Sato went home at 24. She had been offered by then. a seat on the Free Register's drafting commission, an honorary chair at 3 universities, the permanent chancellorship of the human delegation, a Turanite title that translated roughly as she who sets down the stylus, and a marriage proposal from a Bright Fork mining magnate she had never met. She declined all of it, including the marriage proposal, which she did politely, and the drafting commission, which she did rudely. She went home to a small town outside Reykjavik where her brother Kellen ran a hydrology station, and she got a job doing water table surveys, and for 11 years she did almost nothing else. Journalists found her constantly. She was polite to them and gave them nothing. The one interview she granted in her 40s to a Turanite historian who had spent 9 years asking contains the only extended statement she ever made about any of it, and it is short, and it is quoted here because everything else in this account is action, and this is the only place where the thing itself is said. The historian asked her whether she had known, standing at the ledger at 19, that the galaxy would follow. And Wren, who was by then a middle-aged woman with a bad back and mud on her boots, and a scar on her right hand, said, "No, God, no. I thought I was going to be the last registrar of record my species ever had, and I thought they'd hate me for it, and mostly they did, and I thought it wouldn't work." She was quiet for a while. That's the part people never want to hear. They want me to have known. They want it to have been a plan. It wasn't a plan. It was a 19-year-old with a stylus in her hand, being told what she was, and finding out right there in front of everybody, with no warning at all, that there was something in her that would not have it. And what was that thing? The historian asked. Nothing noble, she almost laughed. It wasn't courage. Courage is when you're afraid and you do it anyway, and I was afraid, but that's not what happened. It was, she turned her hand over, looking at the scar, it was just refusal, flat refusal, the kind you can't reason with and you can't buy and you can't starve out because it isn't attached to anything. It doesn't want anything. It's just a thing that stands up in you when someone tells you what you are and says, "No, not that. Whatever I am, I'm not that, and you don't get to say." That seems, said the historian carefully, like a very small thing to have ended an empire with. It didn't end an empire. Wren looked up, and her eyes were sharp, and the historian later wrote that this was the only moment in 9 hours of recording when he was actually frightened of her. The Concord ended itself. It ended itself the day it wrote Annex 22 and admitted on paper in its own law that it needed our yes. Everything after that was just arithmetic and time. She shrugged. All I did was be too stubborn to be sensible. Anyone could have done it. That's the whole point of the story, and everyone keeps trying to take it out. The standing ledger is in the hall still. It is not used. It sits in a case in the center of the floor in the middle of 900 grooves, and it is open always to the same page. The human page, the 15th cycle, the 14th line. The line is blank. Around it in the case, arranged with the Concord's characteristic and unkillable precision, are the artifacts of the record, the stylus, uncleaned, Adie's Nwasu census, all 6,200 names printed and bound, the flight engineer's log from the Ansukaba, a page of arithmetic in 900 scripts. Children come. 900 species of children, on 900 kinds of school trip, filing past a book they will never have to sign. And the plaque under the case does not say victory, and it does not say rebellion, and it does not name the girl, because she asked that it not, in writing twice, and the second time she was extremely rude about it. It says in 900 languages. Here the galaxy expected cooperation. The entry was not made. The cost was paid by those who refused, and by those who did not, and it was terrible, and it is recorded here in full, because we publish everything. Look at the blank line. It is not empty. It is the shape of something that would not be told what it was. Von Eckert lived another 200 years. He never returned to the Hall of Ledgers. He served without title on the Free Register's drafting commission for 19 of its worst years, and he was by all accounts insufferable, and he fought like a cornered animal over commas, and the Register is a better document for it. He is not remembered fondly. He is remembered honestly, which he would have preferred. He wrote one thing about Wren Adeyemi-Sato in the margin of a working draft in his own hand, and it was found after his death, and is now in the case with the rest of it. It says, "She was 19. I told her what she was, and she declined. I have thought about it for 200 years, and I have arrived at this. The flaw was never in the law. The law was perfect. The flaw was that we built a perfect law around a question we were not entitled to ask, and then we asked it, of every species we ever met every year for 4,114 years, and every one of them answered. Until one of them did not. I do not think she was extraordinary. I think that is what frightens me. I think she was ordinary and stubborn and badly rested, and that the thing she found in herself that day is in all of them, and in most of us, and that it sleeps very lightly. We should have asked what they were. We should have asked. On the wall of a hydrology station outside Reykjavik, there is a photograph. It is not famous. It has never been reproduced. It shows a young woman in a badly fitting uniform, standing in a corridor on a station 600 light-years from home, on the day after the vote, 50.8 to 49.2, looking absolutely, comprehensively terrified. Her brother took it, years later, off an archive feed and printed it and hung it there, and when she asked him why, he said, "Because everyone else has the one of you at the ledger." Chin up, hand on the book, the big moment, and it's a lie, you didn't look like that. He tapped the frame. You looked like this, scared out of your mind and not moving an inch. That's the one worth keeping. She left it up. She was a stubborn woman, and it was, in the end, the only thing she ever really was. Not brave, not brilliant, not chosen, simply, permanently, gloriously unable to be told what she was. And when a galaxy of 900 species finally stopped being sensible and stood up in the rain and left 849 lines blank in the oldest book in the universe, it was not because a hero had shown them how to fight. It was because a 19-year-old girl had shown them how to say no, and mean it, and pay for it, and stand there afterward with nothing left, and still, refuse to pick up the stylus.